This is a talk about Hebrew pronominal subjects in acquisition, a usage-based account of peer talk conversation. The talk is by Elitzur Dattner and Dorit Ravid from Tel Aviv University and Haifa University. Go ahead, Elitzur, you have 18 minutes.
Thank you, Dorit. Thank you very much, everybody. So, of course, it's a joint work with Dorit. And the aim of the talk today is to characterize the syntactic discursive environments of Hebrew pronominal subjects in preschool children's developing conversational interactions. So we assume that the manifestation of subjects is context-bound by the type of language being acquired, the verb temporality, and the scenario. And we focus on the indexical first and second pronominal subjects, which are cognitively and psycholinguistically accessible in the pure talk and have no option for lexical alternatives. If you're interested in lexical versus pronominal subjects, you can check out our 2019 paper. So the issue of subjectualization and omission in Hebrew is vastly studied in the literature, mainly in the context of pro-drop discussions, but it was shown to be related to accessibility or licensing or information structure, for example. And zero pronominal subjects are generally possible in first and second person, in past and future tense, and are typically not allowed in all other positions. Hebrew may allow third person zero pronominal subject in some restricted contexts, such as adjunct subordinate clauses or with a particular semantic types of verbs, or in some accessibility related scenarios. And when we look at acquisition, zero pronoun subjects are used by children in all languages, including languages that do not allow them in the adult grammar, such as English. Null subject has been a central topic of generative acquisition studies, and it was explained as related to different grammatical abilities in children and adults, or assuming an extended period where English, for example, allows null subjects. Specifically, looking at Hebrew, Armon Lotem, for example, showed that the acquisition of finite verbs are related to the morphosyntactic features of the subject. So in a study of children of 1.5 years to 3 years old, she indicates that number, gender, and person marking first appears towards the end of the second year of life, while bare subjects first occur much earlier. However, most papers focus on anaphoric third-person subjects, and these are the only ones where you can have lexical versus full pronoun versus zero pronoun alternative. And most papers deal with the nature of omission rather than with the reason to use a zero pronoun due to Anglocentrism. So in the present talk, we discussed first and second person, which are cognitively and psycholinguistically accessible in the pure talk and have no option for lexical alternatives. And we account for zero versus full pronominal subjects in Hebrew, where zero pronouns are part of the child's grammatical inventory. So what is our data and method? We look at the pure talk corpus by Zwilling, and it's composed of 8 hours of recording of 54 children in 6 age groups, 2 to 2.5, 2 to 2.5 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, and 7 to 8. Yeah. Each age group was composed of 3 triads engaging in triadic conversation in all kinds of situations within one of the kids' house. Each recording was conducted in one of the children's homes. It was audio recorded and transcribed, and each triadic session was 30 minutes long, except for the youngest children, where we had them talking for 40 minutes in order to have access to more data at this young age. So what are our coding variables? We have the subjectualization, and specifically here we look at a subset of the data just about full pronoun versus zero pronoun, which is in fact in Hebrew verb agreement. We have the age, of course, 6 age groups. We have the tense, so we're looking at only at past and future. We have the number, singular versus plural. We have person first and second, and we have utterance type. And I'll tell you about it in a minute. So, for example, we have nafalti, I fell, which is first singular past zero pronoun. But you can also say ani nafalti, which is again I fell, but here it's a first singular past full pronoun. And what about utterance type? So we had conversations, not stories. So we could analyze the discursive function of each utterance. So we had initiated utterances where there is no interaction. So for example, A says כואב לי, I'm hurt, and B says אני אביא את הכרית הגדולה, I'll bring the big pillow. So B initiates an utterance irrelevant to that of A. We had repeat utterances where there is a full repetition. So A says בוא נשב כאן, let's sit here, and B says בוא נשב כאן, let's sit here. So B repeats A's utterance. We had resonating utterances, which is a structural repetition. So A says הנה עיגול ורוד, here's a pink circle, and B says הנה עיגול אדום, here's a red circle. So B is using the same structure as A with a slight variation. And finally, we have response utterances, and that is full interaction. So A says בינתיים אני אתלה את הבלונים, in the meantime I'll hang the balloons, and B answers ואני אכין גם עוגה, and I'll bake a cake too. So B is responding to A's utterance. So let's now look at a rather traditional type of methodology, or we tested it using all kinds of regression analysis and classification trees, etc. And here we can see, for example, using a random forest, we can see that there is a variable importance hierarchy. So the choice of using full versus pronominal versus zero subject is mostly affected by the number of the subject and the tense of the subject, and much less by the age of the child or the person of the subject or the clause type. So age, person, and clause type, and specifically what's interesting for us is the age, have very much has a very little role to play here according to the random forest analysis. And we see that all in all in the corpus, future plural, for example, is realized as 0 90% of the time, and only 0.8 as full pronoun. Future singular, on the other hand, is almost always a full pronominal. And in the past, you see that there is a kind of a preference for zero realization. Okay, so that's one kind of results we can look at. But here, we don't see any effect of age. And if we look at the data, we do see that children, the children's language is developing within this very large age range between 2 to 8. So we suggest to look at it from a different outlook using clustering analysis. So we took our data, our corpus, and fed it to a cluster analysis, and here's the cluster dendrogram. And we have 5 clusters of tokens in the data, 5 clusters of utterances that are similar within themselves and dissimilar to other utterances in the data. Okay, so we have the red cluster over here, we have the olive green over here, we have the green over here. So these are 3 big clusters and 2 very small clusters, the blue and the purple over here. And now the question is, how do we interpret these clusters? So we interpret clusters as usage patterns. So cluster 1, one of the 3 large clusters that we saw earlier, is utterances with 0 pronoun, that is verb agreement, first, plural, and future, initiating utterances. So it is a cluster of tokens that groups together these types of utterances. And for example, we can see here, בוא נשב כאן, let's sit here. So this is one cluster. Cluster 2 and cluster 3 are all over the place and are not very definable. So cluster 2 is mostly resonating utterances, and cluster 3 is mostly repeating utterances. That is, the clustering algorithm detected these utterances that are either repeating or resonating as if this is the most important feature of them. So this is what makes them similar to one another. So cluster 2 and 3 are not very interesting from our point of view. Next is cluster 4, and we have a zero pronoun, second singular past, and initiating utterances, as in pagata b'shalosh gulot tanot, you hit 3 little marbles. And finally, we have cluster 5, full pronoun, first singular future, and the response utterance, as in ani azor lecha tov, I will help you. Okay. And now we can ask the question, is there any relations between the cluster type and the age groups we saw earlier? So we see that there is a relation, a very interesting relation. So cluster 2 and 3 are very far away from each of the groups, each of the age groups, and the age groups of 2 to 3 are not very identifiable as belonging or as using any type of cluster in a very singular way. However, cluster 1 is mostly associated with the 3-year-olds. Cluster 4 is mostly associated with the 4 to 6-year-olds, and cluster 5 is mostly associated with the 7 to 8 years old. So what does it tell us? We can see a development of clusters as usage patterns. We can see that there is a cluster 1 first, then cluster 4, then cluster 5, according to the ages in our data. So first, there is a cluster of, let's see it here. It's a zero pronoun, first person plural, future initiating utterances, and it functions in order to call for action. So this is a form function correlation that we found, and it is mostly used in the ages of 3 to 4. Next, we have you hit 3 little marbles, the cluster 4, which is zero pronoun again, but now it's second person, singular past, initiate utterances again, and this cluster is used to comment on the other's action, and this is used mainly in the ages of 4 to 6. And finally, we have the cluster which is cluster 5, I'll help you, okay, which is full pronoun, first person, singular, future, and response utterances, and it is used to plan one's own actions as a response to something in the context, and it is used mainly in the 7 to 8 years old. So now we can talk about the development of usage patterns, and a little bit just to expand a little bit. So cluster 1, it's functionally calling for action. It is a future tense, which is a non-narrative speech mainly used to contemplate and plan. It is initiated utterances, introducing new topics to conversation, and it uses the first plural, referring to the peer group as a collective agent, and it is a setting that is best suited for zero reference. So for example, hey na'achil et habubot, hey, we'll feed the dolls, and it corresponds with the age group of 3 to 4. These are less prone to use full pronouns than their older peers. Okay, so cluster 1, within the possible discourse settings one can have in triadic situations, 3 years old children plan joint actions relatively more than they do anything else. And if you ever heard 3-year-olds playing or 4-year-olds playing, especially 3-year-olds, you can always hear them say, so let's say I will be that and that. Okay, so cluster 4, the next cluster, functionally it is used to comment on the action of the addressee. It has second singular zero pronouns, indicating on the accessibility of the referent in the discourse, initiating utterances, which form the beginning of a new chunk of conversation. So for example, lo tzavata bekachol kan, you didn't paint blue in here, and it corresponds with the mid-range age groups between 4 to 6. So this usage pattern is mostly characterizes the mid-range age group as opposed to their younger and older peers, and it is used to initiate conversations in order to comment on the past actions of their addressee. And finally, cluster 5, functionally, it is to plan one's own actions as a response to some contextual stimulus. It corresponds with first, singular, future, and full pronouns, and responding utterances. It is a part of the cooperative give and take of conversation rather than initiating a discourse chunk. So for example, we have the conversation here. So A says, Abba amar lecha lalechet lishon, Daddy told you to go to sleep. And B says, אז אני אקח את הספה, so I'll take the couch. It is a more mature usage pattern. It is anchored in previous context and provides contextual material for the development of conversation by discussing the future. So cluster 5, we see that the first singular future is unequivocally realized as a full pronoun in the data. However, we asked ourselves, why is that? Because the speaker, the first singular, is accessible. So why should it be marked as a full pronoun? And we think that the answer is that it is a unique context that calls for a full pronoun rather than a zero. It is used to plan one's own action within the conversation, and it is done with regard to the action of the others as a point of reference. So it is a natural place for highlighting the role of the speaker as opposed to the addressee or to some other third-party entities. And also note that first singular is not always manifested by a full pronoun. It is only so in the context of future tense, which goes into this cluster 5 and this function of it. In past tense, we're highlighting the self as an agent of the planned action. It's not the communicative goal. We may find zero pronouns, as in the example over here. So in the 2 lines at the bottom, תקשרי לך כל היום, you'll tire for yourself for the all day long. And B says, כמעט סיימת, I'm almost done. So first singular in the past with a zero pronoun. So first singular subjects behave differently in future and past reference, underscoring the discursive functional aspects of pronominal subjectualization. And subjectualization is not a matter of single governing factor. It is a matter of usage patterns that are anchored in a functional context, each fitting a different discursive construal, such discourse-based patterns, usage patterns, are defined by us as discourse profile constructions. And note that we in fact say that there are different types of subject. It is not a case that there is one grammatical subject, but there is a subject for every discourse pattern. So using exploratory statistics to reveal usage patterns, we can detect developmental changes that were not seen in the classification analysis or other regression analysis, for example, because we see what children actually do, not what they can do, but what they actually do. Regression analysis or the models show us what parameters affect the choice of full versus zero pronoun, and they show us that age is hardly a factor. That is, these factors are inherent to language use and are part of the children's language knowledge very early on. However, children may use these factors very little. So young children have less opportunities to use full pronouns, and these discourse-based opportunities embedded in communicative needs and conversational skills are changing and developing with age. So to conclude, we show that the choice of zero versus full pronominal subjects depends on cognitive and psycholinguistic development as realized by reference to first versus second person, plural versus singular entities, verb tense, the role of the utterance in the conversation, and the communicative function the child needs to serve. So our final conclusion is that the realization of subject is governed by the content of what the child talks about in interaction, their communicational needs, and it is modified by development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elitzur. Just in time, exactly in time. I'm looking at the participants. I'm looking for questions. Please raise your hands in, okay. Mira, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you very, very much, Elitzur. So I have a couple questions. First, when you talked about in the first graph about future plural, which is almost zeros, is this impersonal? What kind of forms do we get there?
For example, בוא נשב כאן, let's sit here.
Oh, it's first person.
Yes.
Okay. So these are fine. Okay, that's not a problem. Okay, so I'm wondering whether what you have here is a development of using zero versus overt, versus pronominal subjects, or you have really a development in what kind of speech acts kids make, okay? And then these speech acts come with these pronominal versus zero as explained, excuse me, by accessibility theory, okay, which was kind of lost in there, okay? So it's not like adults have a different pattern. Adults also have overt first person future subjects versus zero in all these calling for action imperatives, okay? So suppose you have a kid that is using an inappropriate age-wise speech act. What kind of subjects would they use? Would they use the wrong zero? Okay, so in other words,
yeah, okay. What we saw in the regression analysis, for example, or the random forest analysis, is that age is hardly a factor in the choice of full versus pronoun versus zero. So accessibility explains that wonderfully. So children know it from very early on, and they know the rules and they use them appropriately. But as you said, development is not there, because this is a very inherent feature of the language of Hebrew. So development is in other places, in the conversation and the communicative needs, etc. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
I think we can stick in one more question. Amit Almor.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. My question is very similar. Actually, it was almost identical to Mira's question initially, but I just want to kind of put that a little further and ask you to kind of try and explain what is it that you're claiming here. Are you claiming that you can use this kind of analysis to help us understand the cognitive trajectory of development? So, you know, using this analysis, you can actually discover what is the cognitive developmental stage of the child, in that they can actually engage in certain kind of interactions? Or are you trying to make a claim about language development and kind of the order in which you acquire it? So I think it's very similar to Mira's question, just kind of asking you kind of to more explicitly try and kind of explain the goal. What are you trying to do here? Thank you.
Okay, so first, I think that one of our aims is to say that grammatical subject as a category is not the right way to look at development. So children don't acquire grammatical subject; they acquire a subject with a specific discourse function, and they use it as such. And yes, we would like to say something about the language development. I don't know about cognitive development, because we can say something, I'm sure, about cognitive development if we look at the development of conversation, because it will be easier for all the children to maintain topics in the conversation, etc. But we don't go as far as to claim that. We do say something about language development, that it goes through specific tokens, it goes through specific functions of subjects, and only then, if I would kind of keep saying what the speaker before me said, sorry, I can't remember her name, we do start with very specific tokens, and only later on we children abstract a way to form some kind of a category of a subject.